Thank you all for joining us for the SICSS-Africa and African Descendants Inaugural Panel, Interrogating Data Collection Methods Focused on African and African Descendants, Challenges and Opportunities. This panel represents our first foray into planning across 4 SICSS sites: SICSS-West Central Africa and Cameroon, SICSS-Covenant in Nigeria, SICSS-JIAS IPATC in South Africa, and SICSS-Howard Mathematica in the United States. It is my pleasure to introduce my student, colleague, and friend, Susanna Ejong, who will introduce this groundbreaking multi-site SICSS panel. First, her bio. Susanna Ejong is a global development, humanitarian, and peace and security consultant with over 15 years of experience in multilateral civil society and government organizations on 3 continents. She is co-founder of Collateral Benefits, a storytelling platform that documents perspectives from Africans and Afro-descendants about transcending COVID-19, a founding member of African diaspora platforms such as Afro-Innova, Colombia, and Africa 2.0, Spain, and a member of the advisory board of the Collective for the Renewal of Africa, Senegal. From Equatorial Guinea and Spain, Susanna studied at the Complutense University in Madrid, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, is a 2014 Yale World Fellow and a 2022 Harvard MPA Mason Fellow. It is my honor to introduce Susanna.
Thank you so much, Nanette. It's so amazing to be here today with you and everyone around the room to talk about this important issue. The title of this panel is Interrogating Data Collection Methods Focused on African and Afro Descendants, Challenges and Opportunities. And it's so relevant today. We all want to find solutions to the problems of today and the problems of the future. And for that, data must be reliable and of high quality. The reality is that there are a lot of problems with data. The data validity of problems pose significant bottlenecks for creating the right theoretical insights into the complex issues that are peculiar to the people of Africa and the people of the African diaspora. Previous attempts at circumventing data challenges in Africa have relied on surveys, estimates, or models that often do not reflect the reality of many African countries and communities. In order to have a robust discussion, we have to ask ourselves difficult questions. Questions such as, what challenges exist in the collection of precise data? How do these challenges affect how poverty indices and reports are generated? What can stakeholders do to improve data quality? What unique tools are available to collect more precise data that includes the perspectives of the communities studied? This panel will discuss these key challenges in the collection of precise data, as well as how these challenges influence how African and people of the African diaspora are studied and economic indices are generated. The panelists will draw from the unique expertise and experiences working with different forms of data to critically reflect and challenge current data collection methods while highlighting innovations and new strategies to collect data about people of African and African descent. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us for our Africa and African Descendants panel discussion with Dr. Bhaso Ndzendze. My name is Malebo Sipodi, and I am one of the organizers from the SICSS-JIAS IPATC site right here in South Africa. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Bhaso Ndzendze. I will close with a few resources for you to get to know the 4 SICSS sites that organized this groundbreaking event. SICSS-West Central Africa in Cameroon, SICSS-Covenant in Nigeria, our site, SICSS-JIAS IPATC right here in South Africa, and SICSS-Howard Mathematica in the United States. Now to introduce our speaker, Dr. Bhaso Ndzendze. Dr. Bhaso Ndzendze is a senior lecturer and head of department in the politics and international relations at the University of Johannesburg. Dr. Ndzendze is also founder and head of the 4IR and Digital Policy Research Unit at the University of Johannesburg and a Digital Policy Fellow at the Berlin-based African Policy Research Institute. He is the author of 2 books on artificial intelligence and international relations, and is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Digital Policy Studies. His scholarship and opinion on technology, society, and digital policy has appeared in numerous edited books and the press. Welcome, Bhaso. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Malebo, for that very generous introduction. And thank you to yourself and your colleagues, your co-organizers of this Summer Institute for your generous invitation. Now, I have to say, when I received the invitation on this particular subject matter, I was a little bit self-conscious because I am not a data scientist. Instead, I am a political scientist. But it very quickly dawned on me that I am also still, in a sense, a stakeholder in data because I work with data, and data is on the main very political. How it is generated, who is generating it, who is gathering it, for what purposes, and what impact it has. It is all very political. So I do have something to say. And on the main, I'd like to say 3 things, or to focus my inputs today on 3 things. The first is a bit of stock taking in terms of data and Africa, and exploring really what is at stake for the continent. And then I will move to the common challenges with data collection and what their causes are, and what I believe are some misconceptions about their causes. And then finally, to end off on a good note, I will end off with exploration of solutions that have been enacted, as well as some ideas that I have and that my research group and I have been exploring. So what is at stake really is everything. It's a lot for the continent that hangs in the balance when it comes to data, and with a particular focus on digital data, but analog just as well, if that still exists. I think everything has these days a digital signature, and if not yet, it should. It often is in the process of being digitized. So the stakes for the continent are quite high. It comes down to really meaningful and beneficial participation in the 21st century economy and in 21st century life in general. And yet 2 statistics haunt me a bit when I think of the continent and digital data in particular, which is what I work on. The first is that although the continent forms about 17% of the global population, there is still the issue that only 3% of app developers emanate from the continent or are based on the continent. And also when we were writing the book on the left there, we did a study on GitHub projects. We looked at some data on GitHub projects per country, and there is a strong correlation between the number of GitHub projects that are based in a particular country and its economic output. There's a bit of a endogenous relationship there. Perhaps people more active on GitHub because they live in developed countries, or in fact is participation in software development a predictor for economic growth. The findings indicate actually that there's a bit of both going on, but by and large, the participation in digital software development leads to has an impact on economic growth. And then the report on the left that I worked on with 2 of my colleagues listed there, Olumide and Faten, and we brought together this wonderful map, this very helpful map that we generated, which shows the ambition of the continent. I think I like to think of this map really as a statement of ambition by pretty much all the countries on the continent. This plots basically the plans, the digital plans that countries on the continent have. And a lot of it comes down to data regulation and data management. And what we quickly found out is that it's not sort of one way or uniform how you find out and gauge what plans countries have and have enacted in the digital space as well as in the data sphere. Instead, you have to sort of triangulate. You have to go to sort of untraditional sources beyond just legislation. You also have to look at national development plans. You have to look at policy statements. You have to look at leader pronouncements. And so really very few countries are not aware of the importance of having a data policy. But three main problems plague, and I'm speaking here sort of moving between policy and research or policy and academia. There are three overlapping challenges for Africa and the African diaspora, and it comes down to representation, equity, and sovereignty. At least those are the three that stand out for me, and I will touch on each of those as I proceed. To try and be sort of sector specific, I looked at about 5 sectors and spoke to people who work in these areas to find out what problems are they encountering with data management. And as I said, people doing research as well as people doing policy, executing and enforcing policy and regulations. The first point that I noted, and I've done a bit of research here myself, is around agriculture, environmental management, and resource management. The lack of data really means that we are operating in the dark. We don't know really the extent of our wealth, and therefore cannot plan realistically. We don't know the life cycles of our agricultural produce in a number of countries, and I'll demonstrate which countries in particular, because I also don't want to generalize. My team and I have done research on several countries, not the entire continent. But what it means is that we don't really have a clear picture of our sustainability curve. And it still is the case that when there are hints of potential mineral deposits, whether mainland or offshore, whatever the case may be, you'll still find European companies, American companies doing the surveys, doing the study to explore the exploration. So it just indicates a huge problem, which touches on, again, equity, representation, and sovereignty. And then when it comes to the issue of housing, there are also problems here. I've spoken with a number of people involved in land reform as well as in housing for the poor, and really the problems here are so vast that South Africa's big mission of land reform is estimated to be likely to take about 900 years to complete in terms of restitution of land to Black people who were deprived during the colonial and apartheid eras. So this also has implications for, and that is really a problem of data management as well, including in the judiciary, which I will also touch on. It also means we are planning in the dark when it comes to urban planning, and I might also add the rural planning, as well as the resource allocation. Then there's the issue of bureaucracy in the judiciary and elsewhere. And what this means is that there is maladministration of justice. Justice can take a very long time to enact in South Africa and in a handful of other countries. And this is something I've found going through the memoirs of now retired Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke, when he talks about, fortunately for South Africa, South Africa does not have this problem, but a lot of countries on the continent struggle, which means a lot of legal researchers on the continent struggle also with access to resources, to written records, to judgments, basically. And this has huge implications for the administration of justice, and here has huge implications for jurisprudence, because it means it is hard to establish precedent because the records have to be handwritten or typed in old machines, which can take a very long time. There's no central database. So you can just imagine the implications for the legal system. But also when it comes to issues of innovation, if we don't have a centralized, digitalized judicial registry, it means it's very hard to register patents. And that's why you see a lot of African innovators registering their patents elsewhere, because the system is quite unreliable. And again, it comes down to data, it comes down to record keeping. Then there's the issue of language, culture, and heritage. Here, the implications are quite stark for natural language processing, for example. A lot of languages on the continent do not have a sufficient digital footprint, which means when there's developments in artificial intelligence and development of various 21st century technologies, including, by the way, also sign language, which is very underrepresented in the digital sphere. Africa is on the back footing. And then my main focus area, political economy, when it comes to trade, when it comes to FDI, when it comes to international aid flows, again, it is very difficult to have a singular uniform data set. And what we often find here also is that types and categories are played around with. They don't mean the same thing across. This is particularly true with our Chinese partners, where they will make a commitment at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation of $60 billion in aid over the next 3 years. But when it comes down to implementation, we find that actually there's a lot of playing around with categories. So what was initially announced as aid is actually FDI when you apply a strict criteria. And when you, or loans and export credits. So this, to me, indicates a problem of bargaining. Why do we still, for example, have to, because to get data on Chinese loans to Africa, on Chinese FDI in Africa, and for African trade with China, you have to go to Johns Hopkins, the Center on Africa-China Relations Research, and you have to go to MIT and to the Observatory of Economic Complexity. There isn't an African data set. Still to this day, the Forum on Africa-China Cooperation was formed in 2000. So it means 22 years later, there is no uniform, normal categorization and open source sharing of trade with what has become really Africa's most important trading partner. So I'd like to now turn to the root causes of these challenges and really share some of my disagreements with the sort of common sense and common sense view about what the problem is, and to share what I think is actually at work, having done a bit of research on the continent with my team as well. So, and those are the countries that in particular I sort of have had experience with. The first issue that you will often see is, talk about lack of infrastructure. And I find this to actually not be the case. I think, Africa is the fastest digitalizing region in the world. When you look at mobile phone subscriptions, and I know there are methodological problems there, but on the main, it shows an upward trend. It shows also, when you look at what African countries are able to do in the digital sphere. And very quickly when they are determined, and often with their international partners, their international government partners, when it comes to censorship on the internet and internet shutdowns and targeting and the like, there clearly is capability. And I've recently come across this old really notebook that was produced in 1900 by Charles Booth, basically a handwritten book, which is now being digitalized, that he put together to study poverty and to represent poverty in late 19th century London. You can't tell me that we have somehow less infrastructure and less capacity than someone in the 1900s, in the late 1800s and early 1900s in London. So I think it's not a problem of infrastructure, but rather it's a problem of, well, it's a problem of governance, including here issues of access, issues of cost, and issues of trust, and the regulatory regime. And I think here trust is the overarching issue, the skewed relationship between African governments, or at least the countries that I've looked at, and their populations. And this means also the issue is not technical expertise. This is one of the other quick diagnoses you hear about, that researchers on the continent are not well trained, methodologically speaking. That's really not the issue. I think researchers on the continent are very well equipped, and you often hear talk of skills transfer and leapfrogging. That's very in at the moment. But I think here it comes down to extroversion. I think the continent and leaders on the continent tend to be very outward looking. When it comes to conducting research on the continent, they tend to rely on external researchers for one reason or another. I think it comes down to, again, issues of trust between the governments and their citizens. It is certainly much easier for a non-African researcher, particularly Western researchers, to get access. For example, that Johns Hopkins database I spoke about, that's a question of access. Who is given access to the African archive? Certainly the researchers in those countries tend to struggle with getting this information about loans, information about FDI and aid in particular. And then the other sort of problem you hear is that Africa is a lot and very small. So it consists of a lot of units that are very small. There's no scale, and there's too much heterogeneity. And we can think of language. I think the continent is the most diverse in terms of languages, in terms of number of states. Any sort of variable you can think of, there will be a lot of it on the continent. But here again, I think it's an issue of trust and willingness and the types of regulatory mechanisms you have in place. So having looked at these problems, what have been some of the emerging solutions, and what are some of my ideas in overcoming the challenges? Well, firstly, I think there has been a growing realization that we need, certainly by governments themselves, that we need to know what is going on. We need to have an accurate picture of what is going on, so that policy cannot be a blunt instrument. It used to be certainly the case that R&D was looked at upon as a sort of luxury item. But I think with the goodness of time and with generational change in terms of leadership and the people who make policy and the people who make legislation, there's been a growing realization on the necessity of R&D. The fact that it's not a wasteful expenditure, and that in fact it is wasteful to continue to allocate resources without a clear picture of necessity and impact on the ground. There's been also allocation of spectrum, which is long overdue, has been delayed here in South Africa by years of delay in terms of policy willingness, but also months and months and months of litigation over the past 2 years. But it looks to be proceeding proceeding ahead, and that's likely to, it's said to very much decrease the cost of participation, which means it'll also decrease the cost of conducting research. And there's also going to be a vast accumulation of data as more people are able to be players in the digital sphere. Then the issue of under and over and non-regulation, in other words, there tends to be over-regulation, stifling regulation, taxation, for example, of social media participation, as well as under regulation, as well as non-regulation, where you find there's no policy on data flows, transnational data flows, either within the continent or between the continent and external players. Here, I find that there's been growing awareness of this, including, most importantly, at the AU level, and there's been some policy formulation in order to regulate flows. Now, some of it, well, a lot of it has not come down to the ground. I think about 7 countries now have, out of 55 AU recognized countries, only about 7 from last we checked actually have concrete and enacted statutes that deal with data flows. But again, there needs to be a continent-wide Pan-African framework that shapes what data flows should look like between the continent and the outside world. And again, this problem of extroversion is there, but I think there is a lot of collaboration by researchers on the continent and in the diaspora, including in academia and including in business, and collaboration between these sectors. So they're in a way circumventing the extroverted tendencies of the governments. And then finally, I think this one is for the long haul, the issue of trust. There needs, I think, here to be a renewal of the social contract, a fixing of the skewed relationship between the people, the population, and the government. Because, for justifiable reasons, there are post-colonial, post-apartheid, post-civil war traumas going on, and researchers tend to struggle then to find participants, and officialdom can be untrusted because of the skewed relationship between many governments, and I know digital technology has been complicit here as well in terms of the rise of digital authoritarianism. So I think in the long run, and I think with the generational change, generational transitions, this will be improved. The social contract here is also changing in another sense because of the diaspora. I find that people in the diaspora actually are ultimately forced for good, because they tend to be, and I've done some research, for example, concerning Ethiopians in South Africa and in Washington, and what you find, and Eritreans, and what you find is growing trust outside of the country of origin, whatever you may want to call it. It seems that when the stakes are lower, tensions cool when people are outside, and there tends to be a lot of collaboration in business, in research, and otherwise. So I think there's, whereas at home, for example, we know that there are ethno-linguistic groups that tend to be deemed politically irrelevant or problematic by the sort of official state. And in Africa, for example, on average, I think 70% of the same ethno-linguistic population can be found in regionally contiguous territories. So it's very easy to target them. And that has all sorts of implications for, or to exclude. And that has all sorts of implications for infrastructure rollouts, issues of access, regulation, and so on, including also natural language processing, because languages need to be represented in the corpus. So the issue of language is not just between Africa and the rest of the world, or representation rather, Africa and the rest of the world. but also within countries and within the continent. And then there are Pan-African regimes being rolled out, rules that I'll speak about, and guidelines around data gathering that have been introduced and are finding top-down implementation. And this is precisely one of them, I think the main one, in fact, and it is entirely Pan-African. It is entirely African. This is a very important white paper by the African Academy of Science that was brought together by the Alliance for Accelerating Excellence in Africa, which is a joint initiative between what we used to call NEPAD, the African Union Development Agency, and the African Academy of Sciences. And here what they've done is really astonishing and really something to be embraced and implemented at state level as well. This team reviewed basically the state of play when it comes to data gathering and data use of data emanating and collected from Africans. And the guidelines are very clear in terms of the different role players, in terms of creating an environment that is conducive for research, including also the accrual of benefits back to the communities in which the data is gathered. They speak about issues of decolonization, around attitudes and language, and emphasize the ethical translation of research and innovation that emanates from the continent. So this is very comprehensive. It touches on non-medical as well as medical biospecimen data, and it is fully available online. And what I also find encouraging about this this report, as I said, is that it is completely Pan-African in its creation and in its scope. I think also, though, there still needs to be some work in terms of the big treaty that is now in force on the continent. It regulates and I'm speaking here about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. It regulates currently goods and services, and doesn't say much actually about data flows. So it does not really seem like a 21st century document. And there have been subsequent efforts to bring it in line with the realities of the 21st century in terms of data governance. In my study, at least, of the document, the closest I could find was on Article 15 or under Article 15, where it speaks about what may not be done with data, or rather, it speaks about how nothing in the treaty prevents countries from restricting flows of sensitive data. And that's a rather negative, in other words, it tells us what shouldn't be done, or what the agreement does not preclude, instead of also being positive and really being clear and concrete about data flows in the continent, within the continent, and between the continent and the outside world, which is something that's been done elsewhere. In Europe, for example, the GDPR, as well as in the United States, the revised NAFTA, the USMCA, makes provision for data flows. So I think in the next cycle, I think it's due for renewal in the next 5 years, the African Continental Free Trade Area will have to reflect these realities. And then I want to speak a little bit about some work in terms of circumventing some of the challenges around data gathering. So here what we've made use of is Google Trends, which is fully available, trends.google.com, to try and understand how the continent is perceived in one of these important partners that I've mentioned, China, and which parts of China are most interested in Africa. So this is really Google searches for Africa within China, and the the darker the shade, the more searches are being done. It was surprising, firstly, to find that there is interest within Google. I know China uses by far Baidu, which is something I also find to be interesting, and I think quite a bit of an opportunity for the continent to create its own search engines, which is something I'll conclude with in a sense. But here we also think that is a lot of opportunity in terms of development, whereby where you market, for example, tourism, in the tourism sector, where you market your country can actually be much more precise. You can simply go to the people who seem to be more interested on the continent. And of course, assuming that these figures are accurate and that there isn't a bit of diversion with the use of VPNs. This is another interesting political science paper that we did that looks at Google searches for candidates, for political candidates in South Africa for American political candidates, and likewise in the US for South African frontrunner political party leaders. And what we find here is a very consistent correlation between who eventually wins in retrospect and who people in America are searching for. So it speaks about name recognition, and it speaks about prominence. So without fail, since 2004, when Google started tracing the magnitude of searches, always the party leader that is most searched for. So it was Thabo Mbeki in 2004, and Jacob Zuma in 2009, and again in 2014, and Cyril Ramaphosa in 2019. Always the individual who is most searched for in the US and in these particular parts of the US actually tend to win consistently without fail. And the same in reverse. The candidates who are most searched for in South Africa on Google tend to be the winners, again without fail, from John Kerry versus George Bush in 2004, all the way to where we stopped in 2016, Hillary Clinton and former President Trump. See, in this data set, the candidates who receive the most searches, as I said, consistently win the election. And we stopped looking, as I said, in 2016, but some figures from the 2020 primaries also indicate this correlation carries over into within party dynamics, basically. So it's actually a very interesting tool to understand and in fact try to predict who is likely to win. It's a way of international polling, really, as to who is likely to win. As I said here, 4 out of 4 times, the person with the most searches wins ultimately. And again, you can see the spike around November, which is when the election takes place. And this is where, as I said, the searches tend to come from. I think there's much to be said here also about location and about diaspora. Which parts of America are interested in South Africa? And I think that's a great conversation to be had in terms of demographics and diaspora. Then to sort of conclude with a reflection on broader solutions that we have identified in terms of overcoming the data challenges on the continent. There's really some excellent and innovative work being done by collectives on the continent, including in gaming. We have a stream in our team that's looking at the creation of games on the continent. It's a collaborative effort with the Johannesburg Business School, which is also under our university, and the Department of Computer Science in the engineering faculty, where we are actually looking at the politics of game creation, but also the trends on the continent of game creation. There is now a Pan-African Association, which includes 10 country associations of game designers, which is very encouraging. There's also growth in terms of opportunity when it comes to labeling and annotation for ultimately creating AI. In other words, the labeling and annotation of the real world for use by algorithms, which also then has implications for natural language processing, because this has really been one of those silver linings for the continent, because there are so many languages and because external players are so incapacitated when it comes to African languages. This has become a major opportunity for app developers on the continent. There are, I know of at least one app that's been created that encompasses majority of the languages on the continent. There's also one that specializes in African Sign Language, which I think is very, very crucial and would break barriers of communication, and really cut down ableism, which is a serious issue. Then in terms of online retail as well, because global players, particularly Amazon, tend to flourish best where there's already existing grids and infrastructure. But in many settings, including particularly in rural settings in Africa, there isn't this sort of easy mapping out of routes so that delivery is easy. And this has been a huge barrier to entry for big multinational corporations, and has been a huge opportunity for online retailers on the continent. They've been really one of the big winners out of this non-traditional, non-traditional grid on the continent. So because they have familiarity with the context, they've been able to develop their own maps and develop their own delivery routes. And slowly but surely also the issue of trust is being overcome as more people on the continent become banked. But also because of a large number of people on the continent not being banked, that has also been an opportunity for these online retailers, because they can take payment in alternative forms, including cell phone payments. M-Pesa in Kenya being one of those organic and really outstanding innovations to overcome a problem on the continent. Then there's also some really encouraging efforts in terms of internet submarine cables by African players. They are laying out cables there, which has all sorts of implications for speed, but also, as I will show, for sovereignty of the continent, that data sovereignty that we spoke about earlier. Then, of course, digitalization of government systems in many African countries, and many have also pronounced smart city strategies, and so they have no choice. If you want to be, if you want to have smart cities and smart villages as well, you have to get onto the Internet of Things. You have to bring about sensors. You have to integrate AI with the physical world. So you have to gather a lot of data. Then the recalibration of the free trade agreement, as I spoke about earlier, but also I think quite importantly, the changing publishing landscape on the continent. Certainly a lot more journals exist within the continent than was the case, say, 10, 15 years ago. And that means basically the expectations of editors and reviewers are not as skewed as they used to be, where, the reviewers would be people disconnected from the realities on the continent. And also the interplay of north-south dichotomies, where many papers would be, substantially told to revise and incorporate these scholars who happen to be based in the West. And that means, of course, also onboarding many of the assumptions and methods that they use, which tend to be out of touch with realities on the continent. But I think also here, the funding landscape will also need to change when it comes to research. Currently, the emphasis is on international publishing, certainly in South Africa. This, I think, has a very pejorative implication because it means very few South Africans are encouraged to publish within, or people based in South Africa, very few of them are encouraged to publish in local and African journals. It also means that the voices of the North and the West are still placed quite highly and put at quite a high esteem, which I think is not proper and very out of touch. And the other issue here is there isn't a lot of grants around development of data sets. So a lot of grants are particularly interested in publications, basically, instead of the methodological side of things. So it's very few grants that actually are awarded for generation of data sets, because I think, also the funders want publications which tend to be a bit more glamorized than the data sets. So I think that needs to also catch up. Then I think there are changes in the international system that present opportunities for data on the continent. So in 2019, the US-China trade war intensified, and it spilled over particularly to the digital side of things, where now Google, basically Android devices can no longer be the operating system. Sorry, Android can no longer be the operating system for Huawei devices. So one of the first things I did here was to actually very quickly write an article saying what an opportunity this is actually for the continent, for developers on the continent, and for governments on the continent. And I got an opportunity to actually speak to lawmakers on this in terms of providing support for search engine developers on the continent, so that we could actually break this Google monopoly and have a patchwork or a singular African major search engine. And search engines are very political entities, very politically determined. The success of Google is not because it is the best search engine really, but because a lot of money was spent, paying Apple and other hardware manufacturers to make Google the default search engine. And the same is true in China, where the developers of Baidu, the predominant search engine in China, went really, quite physically to every internet cafe that they could find in the mid-2000s, before the rise of the smartphone, to have Baidu be the landing page of those devices in those internet cafes. And today it is more than 90% of searches in China take place within Baidu. So it is a hands-on process, this process of popularizing and making search engines default points of reference. So I think this was an opportunity that was missed. I think African countries were a lot more interested in showing their allegiance to China and standing with China against the bully, against the US, and not seizing the opportunity that it presented. Whereas other countries, the UAE, developers there with the support of their governments, struck agreements with Huawei, as it was now trying to create a new operating system. Question is, what search engine is going to be there? And countries like the UAE and India actually were very proactive in engaging China and particularly Huawei. So I think then this, for me, comes down to that triad that we spoke about earlier. There are positive movements when it comes to equity. The ethics framework that was developed by the African Academy of Sciences that I spoke about. Online commerce, it means basically African money is being spent on African sold goods, sold in African platforms or on African platforms, Zando, Take a Lot, and many others. Also, the issue of app development, again, that's commerce retained. Those are monies that are retained and circulate within the continent, and that's all thanks to data and willingness to, introduce new forms of gathering data, developing maps, and developing apps, and so on. And that comes to the issue of representation as well. As I said, there are now comprehensive apps, or that try to be as comprehensive as possible to try to represent all 3,000 or around 3,000 African languages. There's also the changing publishing landscape I spoke about, and the Pan-African scope of these collaborations that I spoke about. And then the issue of sovereignty. The submarine cables are a huge game changer for the continent. And also the African Continental Free Trade Area, huge game changer for the continent in terms of retention of African data. And of course, the changing international order, the clashes between the US and China, I think need to be looked at closely. I think we shouldn't just be, looking at these developments as good or bad. I think there's a sort of knee-jerk response and talk of the stability of the status quo and so on. But I think every change ultimately brings with it a lot of opportunity for positive developments. And I think one of those is certainly in the digital space, as these two countries, these two major countries, the biggest players on the digital sphere, as they fight each other. I think that presents a lot of gray zones, a lot of time lags that can be used to basically take advantage of the changing global order and to introduce new products, new apps, new systems that are outside of the monopoly that is enjoyed by either of them in the various sectors. And this also comes down to a database. I think we need a database on Africa-China trade, on every sort of product that is traded between the two. I think we need that data so that Africa can engage China on an equitable footing. Can't be the case that in one meeting, these funds are represented as aid, in another, they are represented as FDI, and in another, they are represented as export credits. So those are my inputs. That's where I may be contacted, and that is the website of the newly established Digital Policy Research Unit in the department. That's also where the journal that my friend Malebo spoke about earlier, the Journal of Digital Policy Studies. So you can get to know us, see what research we are working on, and to collaborate, as well as to submit, should you be so be inclined, to submit your work to the Digital Policy Studies Journal. So thank you so much to the wonderful organizers for inviting me for this very important discussion on data. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us, to my friend and colleague, Dr. Bhaso. I know our participants are looking forward to the live Q&A with you during the Institute in June. Thank you for joining us. I have no words. For more information on the work of SICSS sites expressly serving Africans and African descendants, check out each of our websites and resources. Thank you very much.